Guys, in this video, we are going to learn about middlewares in Node.js. So first, we are going to learn theoretically what exactly are middlewares and why do we need middlewares in Node.js. And then we will go to Visual Studio Code and practically create middlewares in our Node.js Express server. So let's first understand what exactly are middlewares. So the best way to understand middlewares is to understand how the web application works and what's the role of middlewares in our web applications. So in every web application, we do have a client on the front end, and this client is making calls to the Node.js and Express server on the backend. So we are assuming that this part is our client, that is the web browser making API calls to our Node.js Express server on the backend. So that's how the basic web application works. Client makes a calls to the backend server, and the backend server responds back to the client with some data that can be displayed on the front end application. So that's the basics of how web application works. So in this architecture, we need to understand what is the role of middlewares. Where do middlewares fit into this entire architecture? If client makes a API calls to the backend server, we have an option to create a middleware functions that acts as a middleman between client and our backend endpoint. That can be the get or post endpoint, and this function is called a middleware function. So basically what middleware function is going to do is every call that client is going to make to the API endpoint on the backend server, it can be a get or a post endpoint. So every call that client is making has to pass through this middleware function. So what is the role of middleware function here? Like, why do we need to pass all the calls through middleware function before the call arrives to the endpoint in our Node.js server? So basically the main idea is to process the request from the client before it gets to the actual endpoint that is going to return the data on the front end. Middleware can do many kinds of operation. One of them can be authentication. It can authenticate the client request and make sure that client has a API key and client is authorized to make a request and get the data from the backend. So one of the purpose of middleware can be authentication, and there can be other purposes for which we can create middlewares. For example, you might have seen many APIs where the user is kind of restricted to make a calls to the backend. For example, user can make only 2 calls per second or 3 calls per second. So all these restrictions can be put into place by using a middleware functions in Node.js, and it can also play another role. For example, let's say you have an application where you have a different pricing in the plans and you want the user to be able to make only 100 calls in your basic plan and 200 calls in your premium plan. So you can do all that by creating a middlewares in between. So basically the middleware is going to count the number of calls user is making to our backend. So basically before client makes a call to backend, we need to authenticate the call. In some cases, we need to restrict the user to be able to make only 2 or 3 calls per second. And in some cases, we do need to count the number of calls user is making per month to be able to manage a different pricing plans on our applications. And we can actually have as many middlewares between client and the endpoint that is going to return the actual data. We can have 3 or 4 middlewares in between doing different operations. Let's say one of the middleware is authenticating the request and another middleware is counting the number of calls that user is making to the backend, and the third one may be managing the pricing and plans for the user. Let's say user is exceeding their monthly limit on the number of calls they can make to the backend. So this middleware can restrict the user to do that. So how it basically works is client will make a request to the backend asking for some data, and the first middleware is going to authenticate the request. Let's say that this middleware finds the request to be unauthorized. So the request is not going to reach to our backend. This middleware is going to respond directly to client that you are not authorized to make the request to the backend. So that's the basics of a middleware function. Now we will go to Visual Studio Code and actually create one middleware function to understand how we can do that in our Node.js Express server. So guys, here I am in Visual Studio Code and I have a new folder open in my Visual Studio Code that is for the middlewares project. So I'm going to initialize this folder with the Node.js Express server, and we will create a basic endpoint and implement middlewares on that endpoint. So let's start by initializing this folder by running a command that is npm init. So now this folder has been initialized to create a Node.js server, and we do have a package.json file here. So I'm just going to create a new file that is going to be server.js, and I'm just going to install some packages into this application so I can run a command that is npm install express that we are going to need for the Express server. And we are also going to be using nodemon to create our start script in this project. So I'm just going to install these 2 packages, Express and nodemon, and hit enter. So now all the packages that we are going to need are installed in this application. So here in package.json, I'll just create a start script here. and this is going to say nodemon server.js, and I'm also going to mention type as module in this package.json file. So that's all the changes we are going to need in package.json file. So I'll go back to my server.js and import express from express. So here I'll just create an express app by using an express module from npm, and this app is going to be listening on port 3000. So here I'm just going to console log server is running. So if everything is fine, it should console log that server is running fine. So I'm just going to save this. So that's our basic setup for the express server that we are going to need. So I'm just going to use my start script here and start this project by running a command npm start. So we can see that our server is running perfectly fine. I'm just going to create a very basic endpoint here, and this endpoint is going to be /data. So this is going to be a get endpoint, and it's just going to return something that can be response.json, and we can return some random data here. So I'm just going to return data as hello world. Let's assume that this is our data is going to be hello world. So let's save this, go back to the browser. So if I go to localhost 3000/data, so here I can see that my application is returning data here, and this data is hello world. So now we have our basic Node.js project ready with the get endpoint that is going to return the data. So this is a point where we will be implementing a middleware function. So the request that we are making to this /data get endpoint should be passing through our middleware function, and that middleware function is going to authenticate this request. And if the request is not authenticated by the middleware function, we are going to return something like you are not authorized to access the data from this get endpoint. So let's go to the Visual Studio Code again. So here I'm just going to create another file that is middlewares.js. So here in my middleware.js file, I'm just going to create a function that is going to be a authenticate function, and this authenticate function is going to be taking 3 parameters. That is going to be request, response, and next function. We'll understand in a while what this next function is, but for now we are just creating a basic authenticate function, and in this function I'm just going to say console log authenticate. So as soon as this function runs, it's just going to console log. So that's our middleware function here in middlewares.js. Now I'm just going to go to server.js and import my authenticate function here. So I can say import authenticate from middlewares.js. So we can see some error here because we are not exporting the function from our middlewares.js. So I'm just going to export authenticate from my middlewares.js file. So this is going to fix the error. So here I have a authenticate function imported into my server.js. So that's our middleware function. So now what we want is every call that is going to be made to this /data get endpoint, it has to pass through this authenticate function so that call can be authenticated with the help of this function. So to do that, I'm just going to put my authenticate function here. So as soon as somebody will be making a call to /data, it's just going to pass through authenticate function. If authenticate function authorizes the call, then this get endpoint is going to return the data to the front end. Now let's go to the browser and see what's happening now. So if I make a call to my /data endpoint, I can see that it's still loading. So if I just open a new browser and do that again, we can see that it's still loading and it's not returning any data as of now. But if I go back, I can see that my authenticate function is running because I can see the console log authenticate in my terminal. So what's happening now is that my call is actually stuck at this middleware. So I'm making a call to my /data, it's passing through authenticate and it's console logging authenticate, and it's never arriving this get endpoint, and that's the reason I'm not able to see any data here. So now what I'll do is from my middleware function, I'm just going to pass this call to my get endpoint by using a next function here. So after my console log authenticate, I'm just going to run my next function here. So if I do that and save it, so now we can see that our data is returning fine on the front end, because now the call is passing through this authenticate function, and this authenticate function is forwarding the call to my get endpoint, and my get endpoint is returning the data to the front end. So this time I'm just going to put some authentication logic into my authenticate function. So here on my front end, let's say that I'm making a call to my /data endpoint, and here I'm just going to pass some query parameters. That is going to be my API key. So that is going to be API_key. Let's say that my API key is ABC. So I'll just make this call with the API key here. So as of now, it's still returning the data, because in our authenticate function, we do not have any authentication logic. We are just directly forwarding the request to the get endpoint. But this time, instead of console logging authenticate, I'm just going to console log request.query.api key. So if I do that and save this. I'll try to make a call again with the API key. So if I make a call and look at my terminal here, I can see that it's logging that API key here. That is request.query.api key, which is ABC, and I'm passing the ABC here. So here I'm just going to say that if my request.query.api key exists and my request.query.api key is equal to ABC, then I'm just going to pass the request to the get endpoint and let the endpoint return all the data to the front end. But if my API key is not matching with ABC, then I'm just going to do a different logic here. I'm just going to respond to the user that you are not authorized. So if I save this and try to make a call again, if I'm making a call with the API key ABC, it's just going to return me the data. And let's say if I'm missing the API key and not passing the API key, so it's just going to say you are not authorized to make the call. What if I pass the API key, but I'm passing the wrong API key, that is A, B, C, D, E, F, and I try to make this call, it's again going to say you are not authorized. So basically this middleware function in between is never passing the call to my get endpoint here because it's not able to authenticate the request with the correct API key. So now I have my authenticate middleware ready. Let's say that I have another endpoint in my application and this is returning some other data. Let's assume that this endpoint is also returning a data. I can use my middleware in my multiple endpoints. I can also use it in the post endpoint. So if I will go to my /route again now and try to request localhost 3000, it's saying that you are not authorized. But on this endpoint also, if I pass my API key correctly, it's just going to return me the data. So you can see that I can create a middleware function here and use it on all of my endpoints here. So that's how we create middleware functions in Node.js. So this is a very basic example of the middleware function, but this will give you a very good understanding of how we use middleware functions in Node.js. So if you found a value in this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.